everybody, this is Ryan McClanahan with historythroughcards.com. I hope you're all doing very well today. This video, I want to share with you the story of Byron McLaughlin, a pitcher for the Mariners back in the late 1970s and early 80s. And I came across his story quite by accident, in fact. And I've never heard of a story quite like this. It is really, really interesting, and I do have a couple of cards of his. Actually, what happened was that I was looking for a couple of rare autographs from the 1980s, and I came across his story because his autograph is quite rare, in fact. And this story, I think, is going to cover why that is. It's from Sports Illustrated. It's called Flight of the Soul Man by Dan Green from March 8th, 2018. And incidentally, I tried to find more articles from the 1980s and 1990s on Byron McLaughlin here, and I just couldn't find any contemporary articles. It was like someone tried to just wash away what had happened. Anyway, this is really fascinating, guys. I think you're going to find it interesting, so here we go. Harry Llewellyn grew up in the 1950s New York City and Long Island, where baseball was stitched into the fabric of his childhood. He liked the Dodgers, loved the Yankees, and idolized New York's collective roster of mid-century heroes: Jackie Robinson, Carl Furillo, Yogi Berra. His love for the sport is such that, even now, his well-trimmed beard, long ago gone white, his eyes brighten as he extols the power of Aaron Judge, and his voice sours of how those idiots, the Dodgers, knifed New York in its heart by decamping west. But Byron McLaughlin? No, that name Llewellyn didn't know until, 1989. By which point McLaughlin was a half-decade removed from a brief, forgettable career in the majors, where he'd pitched for the Mariners and the Angels. Llewellyn, by then, was already well into his career, pioneering the field of U.S. trademark protection, his client base having grown from small-time rock band merchandisers to a burgeoning California shoe company called Vans. In the late 1980s, the sneaker industry was facing a crisis. Knockoff shoes in international stores and at U.S. flea markets were eating into the bottom lines. To stamp out the imposters, companies such as Nike and Reebok needed someone to find the fraudulent sources and then litigate. Someone like Llewellyn, which is how a transient hurler would come to intrude upon this Manhattan lawyer's life, telephoning tauntingly from the French Riviera in a years-long game of cat and mouse. Decades later, Llewellyn never goes long without someone asking about his career's defining case. It's like a bad penny falling from the sky, he says. For a while, it bothered him, the unrepentant con man slinking beyond his grasp. Now Llewellyn says it's reached the point of shits and giggles. Then he says, as if the realization has dawned on him anew, it's such a bizarre story. The Mariners were effectively birthed by lawyers. In 1970, the city of Seattle sued the American League after the expansion pilots played just one season there before jetting to Milwaukee. As part of a settlement reached in 1976, the Emerald City was granted a second chance, but the Mariners that debuted at the Kingdome in the spring of 1977 were something short of Major League. None of their everyday players batted above .275. None of their starting pitchers had an ERA below 3.93. They lost 98 games. The operation was so shoestring that Seattle's front office once warned its training staff that it may need to pay its own way home from a series in Baltimore and file for reimbursement later. Things ended up working out. It was a level of incompetence that clears an organization's rungs, and onto them confidently stepped Byron McLaughlin, a hard-throwing, feather-coiffed right-hander from Santa Monica. McLaughlin's first few years in pro baseball had included a failed attempt to convert from outfielder to catcher in the Expos system in 1974, reincarnation as a middling minor league pitcher for the Orioles a year later, and one season with an unaffiliated team in Victoria, Texas, where he pitched well enough to be signed by the Mariners, who in turn dispatched him to the Mexican League's Nuevo Laredo Telecotes, based in a border town along the Rio Grande. That was McLaughlin's first stint playing in the country that eventually would become like a second home. In September 1977, the Mariners included the 21-year-old in their late-season call-ups, and for the next 2 years, McLaughlin was in and out of Seattle's rotation. There were flashes of promise: a 2-run complete game win on July 3, 1979, often followed by implosion, 5 runs in 2 and 3 innings 5 days later, sending him back to the pen. But given the team's paucity of talent, management gladly let the young fastballer eat up innings. Whether those same people were glad to be around McLaughlin was another story. When you're with a team, it's kind of like a family, said Jerry Naran, a teammate of McLaughlin's with both Seattle and California. Some family members go their own way a lot and don't hang out with the group. Byron was one of those guys. Other teammates say he developed a reputation as a blame-allergic finger-pointer. He drove coaches nuts trying to devise new pitches and training methods or complaining about nagging injuries. In 1979, he missed 2 weeks of action when he banged his hand on a hotel room desk while rehearsing his pitching motion, and he incited the clearing of benches after 2 on-field incidences in Anaheim with a future teammate, the normally placid Angel star Rod Carew. But the most bizarre incident came right after that series, when McLaughlin received permission to travel back to Mexico for his wedding and left a gym bag at the Mariners Hotel for trainer Gary Nicholson to bring back to Seattle. When Nicholson put that luggage through the X-ray at LAX, security stopped him. Inside was a .357 Magnum. The trainer was searched and detained, missed the team flight, and then got an earful from McLaughlin for the ensuing bad press. The pitcher asked for the gun back, but never apologized. After that contentious season, the Mariners shipped McLaughlin to the Twins, but cut him in the spring training. He ended up back in Nuevo Laredo, which was notable for its rifeness at the time with the former A's pitcher Bob Lacey, then with the Salido Ceperos, calls wheeler-dealers players who worked to earn extra money on the side. Some ran guns across the border. Others worked as private security for team owners and their families. Still others got involved in facilitating shady import-export deals, trading metals, ceramics, textiles, footwear. McLaughlin returned to the bigs as an Angel in June 1983 and, after picking up his first win, told the Los Angeles Times, "I was labeled as someone with an attitude problem, a troublemaker, but that's in the past. I'm now with a great team and have the opportunity to pitch." That opportunity would not last long. A month after his return, the Tigers tagged McLaughlin for 4 runs in the first inning of a 13-11 loss. The next day, he landed on the DL with a strained right elbow. The Angels assigned him to AAA Edmonton for rehab, but McLaughlin refused to report. "They hurt my arm, they abused me, and this is what I get for busting my butt," he told reporters. "This," he added, "is how they deal with bad boys." McLaughlin returned to pitch 6 games for the Angels that September and was released in December. 7 months later, his first wife, Guadalupe, filed for divorce, claiming in court papers that McLaughlin had repeatedly abused and taken money from her. There are no records that Guadalupe filed criminal charges. 2 months after that, he was arrested in Carlsbad, California, for attempting to sell 11 ounces of cocaine to an undercover cop. McLaughlin was officially done as a big leaguer, but he had his sights on bigger fortune. A hillside border town nestled between sprawling nature preserves, Nogales, Arizona, in the 1980s was no ideal assignment for U.S. customs agents, who typically participated in an endless series of small-time drug busts that ultimately led nowhere. But early on a Friday afternoon in August 1989, officials at the Nogales-Mariposa port of entry received a call from their counterparts at the Mexican side of the border. A tractor-trailer had been detained trying to enter from the U.S. with 385 cartons of sneakers destined for Guaymas, a industrial port city on the Gulf of California's eastern shore. The boxes bore the logos of well-known brands like Fila and Vans, and they were labeled "Made in the United States," but the shipment was listed as having originated from Busan, the largest port in South Korea. Their paperwork, it would turn out, was traceable to one Byron McLaughlin. McLaughlin had settled some 400 miles to the west in Coronado, California, a tawny suburb of the key-shaped peninsula that juts across San Diego Bay. There he lived an unlikely life for a baseball burnout with no college degree. He drove a Mercedes-Benz 500 SEL, swam in a backyard pool on a quiet side street named Bahama Bend, and commuted 20 miles south from his home across the Mexican border to conduct business, returning at night to his French-Ivorian second wife, Simone, and young son. Simone is not McLaughlin's second wife's real name, which is withheld here for the sake of privacy. Mexico had recently joined the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades, an international accord that limited taxes on imported foreign goods. It was supposed to make the country a more involved player in the international trade market, but it also made conditions rife for opportunists like McLaughlin. Harley Lewin knew all about the GATT, or the GATT, and its effects. He'd spent the 1980s fighting not only counterfeiters, but also public indifference towards their activities. Early in his career, he would hardly get judges and prosecutors to pursue his cases, but then he collaborated with Massachusetts Senator Ted Kennedy on the Trademark Counterfeiting Act of 1984, which increased restrictions and punishments for infringers. When Vans called out that August afternoon with news of an intercepted shipment of suspicious shoes at the Mexican border, Lewin knew he would have no problem persuading the feds to pursue. His investigation began quickly. 2 days after the seizure in Nogales, Lewin sent an undercover PI posing as a potential shoe buyer to visit McLaughlin's office in an industrial section of Coronado, sandwiched between San Diego and the Mexican border, and McLaughlin offered a tour of his facilities. The operation appeared legit, with a secretary and staffers and a nameplate on the door for Beck Buying Marketing Group. But inside the office, the investigator spotted faxes bearing the names of the trade companies and an invoice for tennis shoes from an outfit based in Busan. Tacked to the wall were fax numbers labeled Mexico, Guaymas, the destination of the busted border shipment, Glenn, McLaughlin's brother, and cryptically DY. If these were all dots, no one on McLaughlin's staff of 6, young, inexperienced, and unquestioning, paid well and in cash to carry out specific tasks without explanation of the company's true nature, was connecting them. We were just a bunch of idiots who knew nothing about anything, says one former employee. 3 days after the initial visit, Lewin's PI accompanied an informant to Mexico City, where they met a man who identified himself as overseeing a branch of McLaughlin's business. The manager showed off 4 sample sneakers, which he said McLaughlin advertised by placing a flyer on windshields around town. One, a white low-top Reebok Club Champion with green trim, bore no manufacturing date or factory code on its label, and the color of the lettering on the trim did not match the lettering on the fabric, a clear giveaway of its inauthenticity. The quality of the shoe's supposed leather was so poor that the investigator believed it might actually have been vinyl. No doubt it was a fake. While Lewin stockpiled his findings like ammo, McLaughlin moved his office 20 minutes southeast to Chula Vista. The PI visited 4 times over the next month to search the trash, where he found faxes and memos confirming shipments, plus invoices for companies, suppliers, presumably in Mexico, Chile, and Hong Kong. In October, a U.S. customs agent did his own dumpster dive and turned up airline tickets for one of McLaughlin's employees to travel to a sports expo in Chicago. I wonder if that was the National. Well, who knows? Anyway, along with her event name tag and faxes to McLaughlin from his brother listing the prices for LA gear and Fila shoes. In the sense of catching a bad guy, it was easy stuff, says Michael Woodworth, a U.S. Customs agent who worked with Lewin on this case. If you follow the papers, it was more like accounting than an investigation. That accounting had uncovered what one U.S. attorney would later call a worldwide conspiracy. Heading the operation was South Korean businessman D.Y. from McLaughlin's office wall. According to a federal indictment, the supplier was manufacturing imitation name-brand sneakers in Busan and shipping them to cities on Mexico's Pacific coast. McLaughlin, who was connected with D.Y. from contacts he made while pitching in the Mexican League, would pay between $8 and $11 per pair, then flip them to Mexican distributors for twice that, insisting that he be paid in U.S. traveler's checks, which he stashed in an account with Bank International of Luxembourg. Several other American brokers were indicted for similar roles. At his peak, McLaughlin sold some 80,000 pairs of knockoff sneakers every month. Reeboks, Converse, Nikes, Adidas, Vans. Before expenses, his monthly net was in the high 6 figures. By the time of the investigation, his overseas bank account held approximately $2.4 million. Ultimately, arrest warrants were issued for 18 people involved in McLaughlin's operation. Assets were frozen and seized, including $4.5 million in cash, real estate, gold, jewelry, and cars. What, no baseball cards? I'm just joking about that. McLaughlin's brother, Glenn, was arrested in Miami, having been lured there from Chile, where he ran his own branch of the fake shoe network, according to court papers, by federal agents posing as prospective clients. Glenn spent a short time in jail. According to one news report, he could not be reached for comment. A fleet of dark, unmasked cars even rolled into the parking lot at the Beck Buying Marketing Group, unleashing a swarm of agents who ordered McLaughlin's employees to hit the ground. Finally, late on the night of November 28, 1989, Lewin accompanied a half-dozen armed police officers and U.S. Customs agents to execute a warrant for Byron at his Coronado home. They rang the front doorbell. The officers' holsters were loose, unsure what type of confrontation loomed. A groggy McLaughlin finally opened the door and took stock of his visitors. "Oh, is there a party going on?" he asked. "Am I invited?" The 1980s had been kind to the sneaker business as athletes see Air Jordan in 1984 and pop stars see Run DMC's Hit My Adidas in 1986, brought casual footwear into vogue. Designs grew bolder and more fashionable. Brand names became style shorthand. Nike's annual revenue surged from $270 million in 1980 to $2.23 billion a decade later. Trouble, though, was bubbling. The fervor over footwear had stretched to Mexico, but demand was outstripping supply. Into that gap rushed a cadre of entrepreneurial types with an eye for legal gray areas. By 1990, experts estimated that a quarter of the Mexican sneaker market was in some way illegitimate, either unlicensed backdoor sales of authentic goods or altogether counterfeit shoes, and chief among those providing them with the man known across the border as Byron de Tennis. Upon his arrest, McLaughlin disputed very few of the basic facts of his operation. Yes, he had brokered the import of the shoes in question. Yes, he had shipped them to Mexico. And yes, he was selling them there at widely profitable margins. But what he was doing, McLaughlin and his lawyers argued, was not illegal. The argument was two-pronged and crafty. First, McLaughlin contended his sneakers were merely gray market goods, meaning they'd been manufactured by the very same factories that produced genuine Nikes and Reeboks and so on. They simply lacked the official licensing markings. Lewin says his investigation revealed this was not the case. Second, he offered an interpretation of the Lanham Act, a trademark law passed in 1946, because the shoes were made outside of the United States and sold in a foreign free market. McLaughlin's lawyers argued that there was no U.S. law he could have broken. In hopes of lessening any financial penalties, McLaughlin's lawyers also presented the specious case that only 40 cartons from the intercepted Nogales shipment, less than 11%, were actually determined to be sizable as counterfeiting shoewear, contending that this was strong evidence that much of McLaughlin's business was legitimate. In other words, he was mostly selling real shoes, so cut him some slack. In the end, McLaughlin was charged with violating 7 sections of the U.S. Code, including trafficking in counterfeit goods, entry of goods by means of false statements, and smuggling. At the same time, thanks to the provisions of the 1984 trademark law Llewellyn helped shape, he was slapped with a trio of civil suits from Reebok, Converse, and Vans, who collectively sought $12 million in damages. Lewin and Milan D. Trisanovich, the assistant U.S. attorney working the proceedings, whipsawed McLaughlin between civil and criminal cases, one of them offering a deal while the other reneged, and vice versa, to the point where the defendant grew exasperated. Why were they pursuing him when so many other people were doing the same thing? Llewellyn's reply: "You got caught." According to Lewin, McLaughlin eventually grew so frustrated that he penned a letter to the U.S. Attorney's Office alleging that the only way Lewin and Trisanovich could have been cooperating so well as if they had been in a homosexual relationship. He just couldn't get his arms around that fact that all these people were chasing him. Lewin says he didn't think he'd done anything wrong. Years later, those who encountered McLaughlin remember him as a natural salesman capable of smiling and smoozing even if he fumed and plotted internally. He typically projected the same unflinching, cool veneer with which he greeted police that night in Coronado. But the investigation had revealed cracks in that perfect facade. Lewin was introduced to Simone and says he saw signs of domestic abuse. McLaughlin's employees knew that violent side of their boss as well. His face would turn so red and the veins on his side would pop out and think he was the devil, says one staffer who recalls McLaughlin smashing and throwing phones and, in one fit of rage, knocking over shelves and breaking a fax machine. You had this feeling he considered the world a challenge to see if he could get through his day without losing his temper, says Lewin. I'm bigger and better, smarter, and nobody's gonna ruffle me. He always had that kind of attitude. By December 1990, a year after McLaughlin's arrest, but before his criminal trial began, the defense appeared to be waning, seeing the inevitability of his conviction and perhaps wanting to stem the punishment. He admitted guilt in the footwear company's civil cases and to the federal money laundering charges, for which he seemed certain to receive significant prison time. But that didn't happen. The judge on the case sentenced McLaughlin to just 5 years probation and ordered that he repay $2.5 million. A few days later, Lewin's phone rang. The voice on the other end was as familiar as it was unwelcome. "How are you?" McLaughlin asked. "Just wanted to let you know I'm not in the United States anymore." It didn't take long for an informant to offer a lead on McLaughlin's whereabouts, France, where Simone had legal residency, but it still took months for Lewin and the prosecutors to persuade U.S. courts and State Department officials to go after McLaughlin and enforce a 14-year prison sentence that had been issued by a federal judge after he fled. Even then, French officials were reluctant to cooperate. McLaughlin's actions through criminal in the United States violated no French law. Lewin says he was told that McLaughlin was viewed abroad as a local investor, which Lewin took to mean he was paying people off, or as Lewin says now, the French were whores. Eventually, French authorities agreed to keep an eye on the target for a period of 24 to 48 hours, as Lewin remembers it, but when the U.S. Marshals arrived, McLaughlin had fled. They followed his trail south to the Ivory Coast in West Africa, where Simone had relatives and where local authorities again had him detained. But again, McLaughlin eluded them. Then the arriving marshals were told their man had headed east to Ghana, where there was talk of guards being bribed by a possibly fake Rolex. Begrudgingly, Lewin called off the dogs. His clients were satisfied with the shutting down of the shoe ring that had been undercutting their profits. In its absence, they almost immediately saw their Mexican sales surge as much as 30%. A global manhunt wasn't worth the cost. U.S. law enforcement had more pressing cases to handle. For Lewin, though, the saga was hardly over. The man he'd spent months pursuing was loose, and now McLaughlin was periodically dialing Lewin from God knows where, always early in the morning at his office or on a near weekly basis. McLaughlin chatted about the weather and inquired about Lewin's business, lamenting the fact that his adversary couldn't join him for dinner somewhere. Looking back, Lewin feels there was more to these calls than braggadocio or conviviality, like they were driven by some twisted sense of respect. McLaughlin had grown so accustomed to outwitting others, and there was Lewin defying his persuasion. I think in Byron's mind, I'm his equal, Lewin says. I caught him. Throughout those conversations, McLaughlin would occasionally mention his desire to someday return stateside. Lewin sensed a potential deal, and on an unrelated business trip to France in the late 1990s, several years after his case closed, he finally arranged to meet his antagonist. Years had passed. Lewin hoped that time had softened his old foe's resistance. The two men planned to rendezvous in the lobby of an upscale hotel in Paris, and the day of the meeting, Lewin found the man he'd come to know so well, bold, self-aggrandizing, uncompromising. I have a vague remembrance of him sitting in a gilded chair, Lewin says. I don't know if that's just my imagination. McLaughlin proposed a dollar amount he would be willing to pay as restitution, far below those dictated by his legal settlements. Lewin told him to get serious. McLaughlin asked how he could return to the States. Lewin told him that he could serve his time in prison. He'd float and dangle, Lewin says today of the negotiation. But when it came time to do something concrete, he just wouldn't do it. After an hour of this, Lewin had enough. This is going nowhere, he said, standing up, and he left. He hasn't seen McLaughlin since. Google did not exist in 1989, and so it took a while before Lewin learned that the target of his investigation was a former major leaguer. I looked that up and I said to myself, what a jerk. Lewin recounts, you don't feel sorry for a guy like that. Lewin, 73, now gazes out of the window of his 27th floor Midtown Manhattan attorney's office. The top two buttons on his sand-colored linen shirt rest unclasped, and with his single earring he wears the look of a Key West retiree. Most of the time when you hear about trouble with professional athletes, he says, it's drugs or some kind of altercation with the police or a domestic dispute. That sort of low-level but terrifying activity. Byron was anything but that. He was confident, sanguine, smart. He was the kind of the guy that if he had put the same talent to good use, he'd probably have made a lot more money. But those people can't help it. They're always cutting corners, always trying to make a buck a funny way. Perhaps it's that peculiar premise, Major League pitcher runs international counterfeit sneaker ring, that has lent McLaughlin's story lasting appeal. In 1996, the short-lived syndicated TV show U.S. Customs Classified devoted an episode to the saga, and the writer Patrick Dubuque revived the story for the Hardball Times in 2016. Had McLaughlin's case happened now, Dubuque points out, Twitter would have eaten this thing up. It would have been a running gag. Lewin, meanwhile, will occasionally hear some whisper about the fugitive forever linked to his name. The last lead, about 5 years ago, placed McLaughlin in Thailand, still working in import and exports, but none of this has brought McLaughlin any closer to justice. This has almost been a question of who could outlast who, says Lewin. In my case, I do this professionally, so when a client calls me and says, I've had enough, regardless of what I may feel personally, I stop. If I hadn't stopped, he'd be in jail. There are things that still nag Lewin, how he and others invested so much time and so many resources in going after a target who's still at large, the way McLaughlin is alleged to have treated his wife and others. The idea that he could be pulling the same stunts somewhere else. That guy is never gonna go away, Lewin says, not until somebody takes him down. So this is the 1980 Topps Byron McLaughlin, and I really wanted to add at least one of his cards to my collection just because of his story. And his 1981 Donruss is quite nice as well. I'll show you the back of this. Yep, it looks like that. You guys can pick up one of these cards for maybe $1, $2 at the very most. But Lewin was really correct in that he could have made a lot more money had he done things legitimately. But we've all come across guys who want to cut corners at all costs. It's the hubris, it's the arrogance that usually gets these people. And I'm not a big fan of arrogant people at all. I try to stay away from them. But this is a guy, I think, if he is still alive, and I'm not even sure that he is, he got really lucky, in fact, that the U.S. Marshals didn't pick him up. I have known somebody who got picked up by the U.S. Marshals and literally dragged to a court case. So it's no joke. Those guys are not playing around. But this is absolutely just one of the strangest cases that I've ever heard of, and even covered here on my channel. And if he is still alive, and some people say he's not alive, I wonder where he is, what he's doing, and I'm very curious. He's probably not making the kind of money that he was before, although with crypto and all the other good stuff. And he is an intelligent person. He probably is making some good cash somewhere. And the other thing that I was thinking of too while reading that was the money laundering aspect in the hobby, because I'm sure it happens. It has to happen. When I was thinking about Operation Bullpen, how many FBI agents actually knew what they were looking for or looking at to determine whether or not those items are counterfeit? I wouldn't expect a lot of those guys to actually know how to spot a counterfeit card now. I don't know how many FBI agents are actually in the hobby, specifically with cards. If you were going to go after a counterfeiter or maybe a money launderer, the easiest thing to do is follow the money. First off, everything is almost digital at this point. You can find everything digitally and track it and trace it that way. And that's why I say embezzlement is one of the crimes that you can't get away with these days, just because it's so tough to get away with embezzlement. Yet people do try. I've covered a couple of cases on that and been heavily involved in trying to track or trace embezzlement and fraud throughout my career as a journalist. So and that can get kind of dangerous as well for various reasons, which is why I've always gone under an alias. I thought this is a really interesting case here, and I'd love to hear what you guys have to say about it. If you ever heard of Byron McLaughlin, because I certainly didn't up until maybe late last year. And again, I haven't really been on YouTube or any other platform, just because I'm still trying to work on my book, and I've had some issues with recording on Windows 11. Really sucks. Microsoft, if you hear me, you guys suck, and I'm going to tell you that to your face. Anyway, guys, I will talk to you hopefully in another video shortly, and I hope you all have a very good day, except for those people who work at Microsoft. Anyway, have a good one. Bye.